By the summer of 1945, ships were sinking inside Japan's own harbors faster than anyone could keep count, and not one of them had been touched by an enemy. No torpedo wake crossed the water, no raider stood off the coast. There was no aircraft overhead when the ship went down. A freighter would clear the breakwater, make its turn into a channel that had carried traffic for 50 years, and come apart from underneath while the men on the docks watched it happen. The people whose job was to explain this had no explanation. The man whose job was to stop it understood it better than anyone alive in Japan and could not stop it at all. His name was Kyuzo Tamura. In the autumn of 1945, he sat across a table in Tokyo from a 33-year-old American naval officer named Thomas Moorer, answering questions about how his country had been strangled. Tamura was a captain in a navy that had ceased to exist. He had given it 25 years, most of them in laboratories rather than at sea. He went from the Naval Academy at Edajima to the Imperial University in Tokyo to study physics, and after that, the Navy kept him in research and technical work because he was good at it and they knew it. Before the war, he had spent a year in Rome as an assistant naval attaché and had traveled through Germany and the United States to see what other navies were building. By the last year of the war, his title was Chief of the Mines Section of the Naval Technical Department. In plain terms, the survival of every Japanese harbor was his to defend. He came to the interrogation carrying paperwork. The Americans had asked him to bring records, so he brought what had not burned. Lists of the ships lost, charts of the channels, the count of men and vessels he had thrown at the thing that was killing them. 349 ships and 20,000 men had spent the final months of the war trying to keep the harbors open. 3 out of every 4 of those minesweepers were gone by the end. He did not come alone. Beside him sat Commander Binzo Sugita, who had served on the staff of the escort fleet that was meant to protect the convoys, and between them they had brought lists of which ships the mines had taken, which the submarines, which the aircraft. At one point, Tamura stopped to correct a date he had given in an earlier session, fixing the founding of the Surface Escort Command to the autumn of 1943 rather than the spring. He was a man who wanted the record accurate, even the record of his own defeat. What had done it came from the sky at night and then did nothing for a while. To understand how a man could lose his entire coast without ever seeing the weapon that took it, look first at what Japan was. It was an island built on water it did not control. 80% of its oil arrived by sea. 88% of its iron came the same way. Half the power that ran its factories came from coal carried in coastal ships, and 3/4 of everything the country moved, it moved over water rather than land. A retired American admiral named William Pratt had seen the weakness as far back as 1942 when he wrote in a magazine that Japanese vessels sailed waters where, in his words, almost every mile was mineable. He was right, and it took the United States most of the war to act on it. The reason it took so long is that almost nobody in the American command believed in mines. A mine was thought of as a defensive thing, something a navy laid in its own waters to keep an enemy out, beneath the dignity of an offensive fleet or a bomber force built to flatten cities. The first people to push against that idea were a handful of scientists and junior officers, and for years they got nowhere. One of them carried the idea the whole way. His name was Ellis Johnson, and he was not a career military man, but what the British would have called a boffin, a scientist with a doctorate from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, he was on a dock at Pearl Harbor working on how to protect American ships from magnetic mines. He spent that morning helping surviving vessels claw their way out of the burning harbor, then went back to Washington with a single conviction, that the same weapon could be turned on Japan and that it would break the country. He accepted a commission and went looking for someone with the aircraft to do it. Before the bombers, there were the submarines. As far back as the autumn of 1942, American submarines had begun slipping into Japanese coastal waters to lay mines by hand, a few at a time. A submarine could carry just a small load, and the best places to mine were the shallow, defended choke points where a submarine was most apt to die. Roy Benson, captain of the submarine Trigger, once watched through his periscope as an 8,000-ton Japanese cargo ship steamed straight over a minefield his boat had just laid off Tokyo. The method worked. It could never work at the scale the idea demanded, because there were not enough submarines in the world to seed an empire's worth of harbors, one careful trip at a time. The Japanese had met these mines before, on a small scale, and had misread them. The first ones turned up in home waters in 1942 and 1943, dropped by submarines off the town of Choshi and at the mouth of Osaka Bay. A few cargo ships were lost. The Navy swept what it could find and filed the rest away as a nuisance, and for the whole rest of the war, those two spots stayed the sole places it felt sure a submarine had mined. The weapon was so quiet, so far outside what a sailor expected to fear, that the men it threatened could not make themselves believe in it. It had happened in the Outer Empire too, in the same pattern. When American aircraft mined the Great Fleet anchorage at Palau, Tamura's sweepers cleared what moored mines they could find, but the main anchorage stayed shut, and the warships there were reduced to creeping in and out through a narrow side channel for days at a time. The record of it sat there for anyone who cared to read it before the home islands ever came under threat. The thing that could do it at scale was the B-29. Admiral Chester Nimitz wanted Japan's home waters mined as part of the larger blockade his navy was building, and he said so. General Henry Arnold, who ran the Army's bombers, regarded mining as a naval errand and resented spending his superfortresses on it. The argument climbed to the highest levels of both services before Arnold gave way, and the officer he handed it to was Curtis LeMay, who had just taken over the B-29 force, and who, against the grain of almost every air commander of his generation, thought mines were a fine idea. LeMay was told to fly a set number of mining missions. He flew more than 3 times that many. Assembling the mines on the island of Tinian was its own small enterprise, had it run out of a depot built in a single month by 12 officers and 171 enlisted men. Over the course of the campaign, they loaded something close to 13,000 mines into the bomb bays of the 313th Bombardment Wing. Each B-29 took up either 7 of the 2,000-pound mines or a dozen of the 1,000-pound type, flew north alone in darkness, and let them go by parachute over water marked on a radar screen. By the time it was over, the bombers had laid more than 12,000 mines across 26 fields and 46 missions, and the whole effort had eaten under 6% of the Bomber Command's flying. The price was 16 aircraft. The weapon itself was old. The intelligence built into it was not. Once a mine reached the bottom, it armed itself according to instructions chosen before the aircraft ever left the island. Some woke to the magnetic field of a steel hull moving overhead. Some listened for the beat of propellers. Some waited for the swell of water pressure that a moving ship shoves ahead of itself, and that last kind could not be swept by any method then in existence, because nothing in a minesweeper's gear could imitate the displacement of a loaded freighter without being a loaded freighter. The Japanese settled on the one answer left to them, which was to run small boats across suspect water and let the crews set the mines off by their own passage. It is a clean sentence to write. It meant ordering men into water that might kill them in order to learn whether it would. The part that broke Tamura's section was simpler than the physics, and worse. Many of the mines carried a counter, set somewhere between 1 and 9. A single mine could be told to ignore the first ship that passed over it, and the second, and the 6th, and to fire under the 9th. It could be told to stay asleep for days before it armed at all. What that meant in the water was that a swept lane proved nothing. A minesweeper could drag a channel and call it clean. A column of ships could steam through without a scratch, and the channel could still be holding a mine in the mud, counting hulls, waiting for its number. The ship that died was often not the first to take the chance. It was the one whose captain had watched the others go through ahead of him and decided the water could be trusted. There were about 200 ways to set these things, and they were changed from one field to the next so that no countermeasure a man worked out in one harbor carried over to the next. A Japanese officer put it to his interrogators after the war without dressing it up. The constant change of mine types was effective, and they were never given the time to find an answer to one before the next arrived. By the spring of 1945, the long routes were already dead. American submarines had spent 2 years hunting the convoys that came up from the oil of the South and the ore of the mainland, and had cut most of those lines to nothing. What was left to Japan was the inner zone, the close home waters where coastal ships still carried coal and food between the islands, and the throat of that whole system was a single strait. Whoever closed Shimonoseki closed the last working artery of the country. The first seeding went in on the night of March 27th at full wing strength into the Shimonoseki Strait. Shimonoseki is the narrow neck of water between the islands of Honshu and Kyushu, and almost everything Japan brought in from the Asian mainland passed through it. Coal from the north, food and ore and oil moving up from the conquered south. Something on the order of 500,000 tons of shipping squeezed through that strait every month, much of it bound to or from China and Korea. And the planners chose it first because it was a bottleneck, a place too narrow for the enemy to defend and too vital for him to abandon. The Japanese response to the first mining is a measure of how strange the weapon was, because for a time they did not understand what was happening to them. There was precedent for the confusion. When American bombers had dropped a handful of mines into the Rangoon River in 1943, the local Japanese had laughed at the pilots for missing every target in sight and dumping their loads in the river. Then 2 ships named Sankyo Maru and Takao Maru blew apart in that same river, and the laughing stopped. The same slowness to believe returned to the home islands 2 years later, and it lasted longer than it should have, because the commanders of outlying areas had not passed the full truth up the chain. American analysts later decided those officers had shaded their reports to save face, which left the authorities in Tokyo underrating a danger that was already at the country's throat. The men with the most reason to learn the truth were the slowest to accept it. Merchant captains feared American submarines because a submarine fired a torpedo, and a torpedo was a thing a sailor could picture coming at him. A mine that lay on the bottom for a week and chose its own moment fit nothing in their experience, and some of them went on blaming submarines for losses no submarine had caused, steering by a fear that was already out of date. Once the ships began to die, the confusion gave way to a problem no one in Japan could solve. By the end of the first month in the Strait, 113 merchant ships had struck mines and gone down there, about 1 ship in 10 of everything Japan had left afloat. Traffic through Shimonoseki, measured in tons a day, fell from 70,000 in March to 35,000 in April, to 7,500 in May, to 1,750 in June. By midsummer, the Strait was carrying 1/10 of what it once had. Sit with that for a moment, because the figures move past it fast. A nation that fed its people and ran its industry on coal and rice, carried across the water, was watching that water close, channel by channel, with no enemy ship anywhere in sight to fire at. One of the consequences reached the largest warship ever built. In the first week of April, with the convenient route through Shimonoseki shut, the battleship Yamato was forced to take a different path toward Okinawa out through the Bungo Strait. American carrier aircraft found her there in open water and sank her with most of her crew. The mines never put a hole in Yamato. They closed the door she would have used and pushed her out through the one the carriers were watching. The campaign moved in phases, each one widening the net. The first ran from late March into May and was aimed at supporting the Okinawa landings by sealing Shimonoseki. The second turned on the industrial heart of the country, the inland sea and the ports of Kobe, Osaka, Tokyo, and Nagoya, and reseeded Shimonoseki for good measure. The third and fourth reached up the western coast of Honshu and around Kyushu and pressed harder on the same wounds. The fifth, which opened in the second week of July, extended the mining into Korean waters and closed the ports of Moji and Niigata. It ran through August 15th, 6 days after a second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. The mines outlasted both cities. The count climbed month over month. In April, the first full month, mines sank 18 Japanese ships. In May, the number jumped to 85, better than 200,000 tons sent to the bottom or knocked out of service, and that was before the campaign reached its widest phases. The fields the bombers laid held on average something close to 500 mines apiece, and the effect of seeding them showed almost at once. The design of the campaign made the sweeping a trap that could not be won. When Tamura's crews managed to clear a channel and reopen it, American reconnaissance would note the traffic moving again, and a small force of bombers would return in the dark to seed it once more. A whole wing was not needed to keep a swept lane closed. A handful of aircraft could undo a week of dangerous work, and the Japanese were left clearing the same water over and over, while the rest of the coast went unwatched. A swept channel reopened in the morning could be a mined channel again by the next night. There was no winning pace to set because the enemy could remine faster than the sweepers could clear and at a fraction of the cost. The harbors went down one after another. Kobe's traffic dropped by 85% in 4 months, from 320,000 tons to 44,000. Osaka, Tokyo, Nagoya, Moji, Niigata, the Korean ports that fed the empire's war effort, all of them ended up closed or close to useless. 35 of Japan's 47 essential convoy routes were given up. The country reached a point where it was moving anti-aircraft guns to defend the harbors rather than the cities, because, as the Japanese themselves put it, the lifelines from the continent that brought food and supplies came before the protection of the people in the towns. It was a sensible thing to prioritize. It came far too late. Knowing the water was mined did not stop the sailing. There was nothing behind the harbors to fall back on, no overland route that could move what the ships moved. So captains were sent into channels they knew to be salted, because a nation that stops carrying coal and rice has stopped fighting. Crews went out regardless of the losses, pushed by shortages of food and fuel that left them no better choice, and the mines took them at a steady rate for it. In the Shimonoseki Strait alone, across the last phase of the campaign, 66 more ships struck mines and went down in water their own navy had been trying to clear since spring. The strait that once carried 500,000 tons a month had become a place ships entered and did not leave, and still the orders to enter it came. The point of all of it was never the ships. The ships were the road, and what traveled the road was the difference between a nation that could fight and one that could not. With the harbors shutting, the coal stopped reaching the factories that ran on it, and the factories that survived the firebombing went idle for want of fuel. They could see stacked at ports they could not reach. Salt ran short. Food ran short. Trains slowed as the coal that moved them thinned out. An island that imported its survival was being made to live on what it already held, and what it already held was running down by the week. An American study had predicted this before the first mine fell. Shut the strait and a few western ports, and Japan's industry and its food would both give out. Defending against the mines turned into a kind of vigil. Observers sat in fishing boats and stood on beaches and climbed the hills above the strait to watch for the bombers and mark where each parachute came down. So the sweepers would know which stretch of water to fear by morning. Radar and searchlights and underwater listening gear were turned on the problem. The Americans added leaflets to some of the drops, telling the population what was being done to them, so that fear would do part of the work the mines could not. 3 B-29s were shot down over the harbors across the whole campaign. The crews counted 54 fighter attacks in all and claimed 1 Japanese plane in return. The mines kept coming. For Tamura, the war became a technical problem he could see in full and could not answer. He was a physicist. He understood what these mines were, how each one fired, why his sweeps failed, what every new variant was doing in the water. None of that understanding helped him because knowing how a pressure mine works does not give a navy a way to sweep it, and watching a channel get reseeded faster than the sweepers can clear it does not cost the bombers a single sortie. His later assessment of how the Americans ought to have run the campaign was the verdict of a man who had studied his own defeat from the inside of it. Asked whether continuous mining or occasional heavy mining hurt him more, he told the Americans the steady feed was far worse, because a single large field could be swept once and then trusted, while a constant trickle meant his men could never trust any water at all, and never got a night of rest. The Americans had understood the leverage of it before Tamura ever felt it. As far back as the summer of 1944, Admiral Thomas Kinkaid had written to his own naval chief that aerial mining was on the order of 100 times as destructive to the enemy as the same number of bombing missions. By the standard the bombing survey used after the war, no other method the United States employed against Japanese shipping did as much harm for the cost. The men under him paid for that with their lives. 3 minesweepers lost out of every 4 is not a number, a Navy shrugs off. The strain reached places a technical officer could not repair. One Japanese commander, Tadao Kuwahara, told Allied investigators afterward that crews had become almost impossible to hold together at the end, that there was a strong tendency for men to jump ship rather than sail into the harbors. The inland zone effort alone cost the Navy more than 35 million yen, a figure Tamura had written on one of his lists. There is a hole in those lists, and the hole says something. When the Americans asked him for the month-by-month record of passage through Shimonoseki, he could hand over July and almost nothing else. The figures for April, May, June, and August had burned in the collapse, along with most of a vanishing government's paper. He told them the missing months had looked much the same as the one that survived, which is to say ruinous, but the proof was ash. The strangeness did not end with the surrender. When Tamura sat down with Moorer that autumn, he still held his post, because the job was not finished. The war was over and the mines were still in the water. Thousands of live American mines sat on the bottoms of Japan's harbors, indifferent to the peace, and the man responsible for getting them out was the same man who had failed to keep them from killing his ships in the first place. He would spend years at it. The harbors he could not save in war, he swept in peace, one slow field after another, and the work followed him into the next decade and another country's war. By the final weeks of fighting, the picture was beyond argument on both sides. Mines laid by aircraft had sunk or damaged about 670 ships, more than 1.25 million tons. In the last half year of the war, that one weapon had put more enemy tonnage on the bottom than every other American cause combined. And for every dollar and every life it cost, it did more damage than the strategic bombing and the submarine campaign, both. When the Strategic Bombing Survey wrote its own conclusions in 1946, its analysts judged that the United States should have begun this kind of mining far earlier, and that doing so might have brought the war to its end without an invasion at all. Japan's own industrialists had run the arithmetic forward and carried it to the military leadership before Hiroshima. Another year of war, and 7 million Japanese would starve. The name the Americans had given the operation was not a figure of speech. A commander on the minesweeping side, Saburo Tadanuma, said afterward that the mines were among the main causes of the defeat, and he was placed to know. This is the part that should unsettle anyone who learned the end of the Pacific War as a story of 2 cities and one kind of bomb. Months before either of those, a few squadrons of bombers, asking for 6% of the effort and losing 16 of their number, had closed the harbors of an island nation and set it on a measured road toward mass starvation with a weapon that never once showed itself to the men it killed. When the Americans put the question to Tamura without softening it, asking whether the United States had split its effort between bombing and mining the right way, the chief of Japan's mine section did not flinch from the answer. The result of the B-29 mining, he said, was so effective against the shipping that it starved the country, and he added that the Americans could probably have shortened the war by starting earlier. He called the policy a far-sighted one. It was the judgment of the one man in Japan best equipped to deny it, offered without being pushed. He was not alone in it. Prince Fumimaro Konoye, who had twice served as prime minister, told the same investigators that the mining of the harbors had been as effective as the burning of the factories, and a steel director named Takashi Komatsu said much the same about what the loss of the sea lanes had done to Japanese industry. There are a lot of these stories that don't get told, and this is one of them. If you want us to keep telling them, subscribe. What makes the whole thing stranger is how close it came to staying a footnote on the winning side as well. The campaign left behind no photograph anyone remembers. There was no skyline, no fireball, no flag on a hill. It produced charts of empty channels and lists of ships that were there one week and gone the next. And when the war ended, the country that had run it mostly forgot the weapon that had worked best of all. The young officer taking the notes did not forget. Thomas Moore spent the months after the surrender taking apart the wreckage of the Japanese war effort for the Strategic Bombing Survey. And the questions he put to Tamura about how a harbor dies were not idle ones. He rose, and he kept rising. He became Chief of Naval Operations, and then the senior officer in the entire American military as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In May of 1972, holding that authority, he ordered the mining of Haiphong Harbor in North Vietnam and said he had long believed that doing it sooner would have made the difference in that war as well. 27 years after he faced the man whose harbors had been killed without a battle, he reached for the same weapon, for the same reason, and used the lesson the captain had handed him across a table in a defeated city.